Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we worship at the altar of Jennifer Check. I'm Anna Bogutska, co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, welcome. In this fourth series of the podcast, we're looking at teen horror, how it's evolved from the 1970s onwards, and why teenagers, and especially teenage girls, make for some of the most compelling protagonists of the genre. And what film fits this bill more perfectly than the previously maligned, recently reappreciated 2009 teen girl magnum opus Jennifer's Body? Written by Diablo Cody, fresh off her Oscar win, directed by Karen Kusama, and starring Megan Fox and Amanda Seyfried, this film was so badly mismarketed at the time of release that it took us about a decade to fully recognize its merits. What you're going to hear is a lightly re-edited version of an episode we recorded last year as part of our Female Monster season, which of course I should totally revisit and absolutely forgive my ever-evolving mixing skills. This episode also marks the first appearance on the show of now frequent guest and dear friend of the pod, Jordan Crucchiola, the world's most renowned Jennifer's Body scholar and power podcaster if there ever was one. Do follow and support her work. A quick reminder, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at TheFinalGhostUK. We also have a Patreon where you can support our work and get occasional bonus episodes, specifically looking at new horror releases. Last week, we reviewed the new Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which just came out on Netflix. And if you are new to the show and for some reason have never seen Jennifer's Body before, please do know we spoil everything pretty much from the very beginning. And with all of that said, please enjoy our retake on Jennifer's Body. Jordan, I'm so pleased you agreed to come onto this podcast to talk about these two murderous cheerleader movies with me.
You're absolutely right. Somehow till this very moment, I had not put them both in the cheerleader canon, and they absolutely are. Wow. Much disrespect to the Devil's Kettle Devils on that one, for just taking them out of the picture entirely. No, I'm thrilled. I am thrilled to be here. I'm always happy to talk about Jennifer's Body, and I am always happy at the idea of someone bringing But I'm a Cheerleader, or not But I'm a Cheerleader, All Cheerleaders Die into the conversation, because it does not get enough love in horror circles, or anywhere, but come on, we are the ones who should be talking about it.
This is absolutely true, and I'm also only mildly scared, or actually really excited to be talking to the world's foremost Jennifer's Body scholar.
Yep.
So I'm fully expecting to get schooled.
That is self-styled, and I stand with it in strong conviction. So as I said to you before we started formally recording here, if anybody else would like to claim the title of world's foremost Jennifer's Body scholar, find me on Twitter. We should have a conversation, because I think we've got a lot of notes to share with each other. So let's bring our minds together if you too think you are the foremost Jennifer's Body scholar in the world.
So let's kick off with Jennifer's Body first.
You and me are going out tonight. Wear something cute, okay?
You always do what Jennifer tells you to do.
It's just that I like the same things that she likes.
Hey, Jennifer. You look really pretty.
Why don't you just come by my place? Well, this is random.
This isn't really your house, is it?
We can play mommy and daddy.
No way.
We always share your bed when we have slumber parties. Jennifer's evil.
I know.
No, I mean, she's actually evil. Not high school evil. Chip is looking really cute to me lately. How is he tasting these days? You are never a good friend. You could have anybody that you want. Why Chip? You're killing people. No, I'm killing boys. Are you scared? Thought you only murdered boys. I go both ways. I will finish you if I have to. Okay. You can barely finish gym class.
So, what is your relationship with the film and with Karyn Kusama's films in general?
I am big proponent of Karyn Kusama, big fan. The funny thing about Me and Jennifer's Body is I was so excited to see it when it came out. I was fully hyped. Big Megan Fox fan. Loved Megan Fox in the Transformers movies. I absolutely understand the correct critiques of the way she was handled at such a young age. As a sex object in a movie playing a teenager in which she was hardly, maybe not even done being a teenager herself, in Transformers. But honestly, actually, if you take the performance on its face, Michaela Baines is an actually great action heroine, and Michaela Baines and Sam Witwicky together are actually one of my favorite screen couples ever. Shia LaBeouf and Megan Fox had tremendous chemistry together, and she, in her moxie, brought so much more to that character than was on the page. She doesn't really actually get enough credit for bringing so much energy and so much life into Michaela as she did. It just sort of gets written off as like a trashy action role, but it's actually a pretty great action heroine role. And as such, I didn't have, there was no hang up with me for Megan being the face of the film. I was very excited. I was like, oh my God, it's a horror movie and it's Megan Fox. I get to have both things at the same time. This sounds rad. And I liked Juno very much. But I felt like I was getting even more excited to see how Diablo Cody was going to bring her specific style to what was being, teased poorly in the trailers for the movie at the time it was coming out in 2009. But I was very excited for the blend. Like, I was like, wow, hey, Amanda Seyfried, like, I'm a Big Love fan. I like her on that show. I would like to see her big doll eyes put in this role and see what she can do opposite Megan. So I was super jazzed, went and saw it, loved it. The kiss, had no idea that was coming, knocked me out of my chair. Went and saw it multiple times in theaters, had no idea. I didn't have a lot of friends at the time who really liked horror movies. So the fact that nobody else around me wanted to see it was like, yeah, I get it. Like, I don't have many friends who I would go see a vampire movie with anyway, like a succubus movie with. So the fact that, like, people around me weren't clamoring to see it, I was like, yeah, I get that this is more my thing. I didn't understand people didn't like this movie genuinely till like 5 years ago. I didn't understand. Like, I didn't give a shit about like box office or anything like that. And I wasn't like looking up Rotten Tomatoes scores. Like, I was doing culture journalism, but I was at Wired, and it was sort of very much more adjacent to like the core of entertainment industry journalism that I would move more toward at Vulture and New York Magazine. So I was just kind of like, I was only sort of reporting on stuff from like an interest in fan point of view as opposed to like an industry beat reporter perspective. When I started seeing like the, film Twitter, I know so many wonderful writers from there now and so many delightful people, but as an entity, it's horrible. And when I started seeing the like film Twitter mindset happening around Jennifer's Body, the butt actually it's bad before its sort of reclamation started, I was like, wait. Anybody out there thinks Jennifer's Body is not a great movie? No idea. Fully no idea. So then I had long been outraged as a Fox fan at her mistreatment in the media for ages, like forever angry about that. So then I had a new anger that was about defending Jennifer's Body that I didn't know I needed to do, an action I didn't know I needed to do, on top of my long-standing, like, in defense of Megan Fox mindset. So I only came late to the fact that this movie needed to be reappraised. But then once it did, I was like, well, I guess I've got to throw myself all into this because it's extremely important. This is extremely important, this movie, to me and to genre cinema. And okay, hell yeah. And then a couple years later, once the sort of reclamation that started, which anybody is free to correct me of sort of when this formally started cropping up, but I sort of hang the online grassroots reclamation of the movie on that Mary Sue piece I forget who the writer was, but I believe the title of it was, "So when are we going to apologize to Megan Fox?" That to me was the first thing that started, and then there were variations on that article that started coming out, and then there were the feature pieces that started coming out, like Louis Peitzman's great feature at BuzzFeed where he spoke to Karn and Diablo about it, and then it started getting more of a formalized movement. So that happened, I think, around like I think that was 2017. I think Lewis's piece came out in 2018, and then 2019 was the 10th anniversary of it, which by the time the anniversary came around, the conversation seemed to have shifted very distinctly to, instead of being, hey guys, Jennifer's Body is actually good, to, hey guys, it's time to celebrate that really good movie, Jennifer's Body. Like, it felt like there was a tone of the defensiveness in the tone of defending it. The defensiveness in the tone of protecting it had changed to a celebratory tone. Because it kind of seems like we won. Like, it seems like the Jennifer's Body protectors won. Like, we won.
So it's an interesting point too, before we go into the actual movie itself, the text itself, it's interesting to understand the context of it, to why it even needed reclaiming. And I find it fascinating that you kind of discovered sort of after the fact, after you'd already fallen in love with the film. But why do you think it was so reviled, or reviled is a strong word, but there was a really distinctive antagonism towards it from the very, very start at the time of release?
Oh, yeah.
And why do you think it was? And kind of what about it kind of made it so divisive around the time where it was actually formally out in 2009?
We were just so on the precipice of so many aspects of it working, and of being able to get so many aspects of it, that I think we were getting attuned enough to the conversations that would be fundamental to Jennifer's Body, to where they were still agitating people. Like, they were close enough to the discourse to where they weren't like, what's feminism? What's gay people? What's queerness? Those things weren't so outside our perspective that they were like an unknown evil. They were close enough, though, to where they were experiencing almost like this pre-lash in the discourse before they were actually going to become, I think, fully fledged part of the ways that we break down and talk about pop culture generally, in ways that are widely accepted. But it was like this sort of that last gasp of an era, not of like, we made it, we solved misogyny. No, we have not. But we are at a point now where calling out misogyny is a routine part of examining art. Whereas at that time, it was sort of the dying days of media culture where you couldn't, where that wasn't de rigueur, where it wasn't allowed, where it was unheard of, and where magazine feature piece after feature piece was being, profile after profile was being written about actresses where they were like framed by their male writers to sound like first dates, and they were negging, and they were sexist, and they were objectifying so often. And like, I think I saw somebody on Twitter post once last year, like, every woman who had a profile written about her between like 2000 and 2010 deserves an apology. And then someone responded and was like, or every woman of all time. But there was this like particular form of celebrity access journalism that happened around that time when blogs were popping up, like Perez Hilton and like The Superficial, where we had more access to celebrities entirely on our own terms because social media hadn't come around yet. And so there was this vying for attention, and there was this star-making machine that demanded imaging and persona building in a way that almost seemed to reflect like the prefab band days of like the Monkees back in the 60s and 70s, like the Jacksons and the Monkees and these sort of family units where we created a show around them and a whole product packet, like a whole packaging ecosystem around them. And it felt like we were doing a lot of that in the late 90s and 2000s, again, around like boy bands and pop stars, Britney Spears and Backstreet Boys. So there was this commodification of the starlet that felt like it was dredging up this old bad thing we had done in like the mid-century. And it was vicious because it was the internet too. And that was making everything more competitive. It was meaning there was more space to be taken up, which means there were more covers and websites for people to be on. And instead of like moderating access, it seemed like the goal of publicity was to put your star, your product, into as many things as possible. And with Megan, the branding that she very much was aware of at the time was the sex bomb image, was the, the girl on the cover of GQ being photographed by Terry Richardson in a bikini and like with a sucker in her mouth. And Megan was very much aware that what appealed to people about her, particularly men, was this pinup image, was this wild bisexual image, was the like basically the Mrs. Steal Your Man, maybe Mrs. Steal Your Girl, after her like, comments about like making it sound like she, would like to engage in a relationship with Olivia Wilde and that were much ballyhooed at the time. There was so much of an idea around her that it became a sort of inescapable trap. And she knew that too. You read any substantial profile of Fox from the time. She was very much, I think that the title of the New York Times profile that came out about her in 2008 or 9 was like the making and unmaking of Megan Fox. And it was a full meta examination of Megan's role in creating her image and knowing that it was effective while also carrying with it the burdens of backlash that she was entirely keyed into. But she was, regardless of her self-awareness, spoken about as a bimbo. She was taken down for her role in these thin, fluffy Transformers films. She was reduced to a sex object. And it didn't matter what she said. It didn't matter her intellectual role in her own life and her self-awareness. People decided these things about Megan Fox, and it was a time, too, that we could objectify comfortably and we wouldn't self-examine. We wouldn't scrutinize that at all. And it was also a time where I feel like when women were extremely complicit in that problem, but I just don't like her face. There was a lot of condemnation of like, like early Taylor Swift was like, I mean, she just annoys me, I just don't like her face. And that could be like a valid criticism for women being bitchy about other women. And in that, like, I don't know, competitive or consumptive or, covetous way that things get sort of mixed up with sort of female-female relationships. And then there was, Diablo Cody. Again, I've said this over and over again. I cannot cite where this quote came from. I do not remember where it came from, but I swear to God it's real. There is a quote where Diablo Cody talks about she had won her Oscar for Juno, and she knew she had the most capital in Hollywood that she was ever going to have. And she had this dream project she wanted to make, and it was Jennifer's Body. And she knew it was going to take all that capital from the Oscar to get it. She knew she had her carte blanche after that. So she was like, fine, I'm going to finally I'm going to make this movie because now's probably one time I'm going to get to do it. And then she effectively ended up spending all that cultural capital on that one movie. And you have Karin Kusama, who has gone from, Girl Fight, breaking out at Sundance with like Michelle Rodriguez to getting that tap to make a studio film in Aeon Flux. So she had, like in the eyes of the studio system, sort of leveled up in that way where they could hand her blockbuster. She had earned her place. And so coming off of Flux, a big Charlize Theron movie, she got attached to this at Fox Atomic. And so you had these three women, and Fox was definitely, or Kusama was definitely a more low-key figure at the time than Cody and Fox were. But the alchemy of all three of them coming together, and it's kind of crazy how it worked. The marketing was horrible. The way the studio tried to get this movie out was so wrong-headed and so misguided and betrayed the spirit of the movie. And yet, they were basically left alone to make the movie they wanted to make. Like when you hear Karin and Diablo talk about making this movie, there were trials, but it seems to start to get most heated when the packaging and presentation of the movie was what became an issue. It wasn't like they had a ton of interfering studio notes. They didn't have a producer there staring over their shoulder trying to get them to change the movie. They didn't end up with some Frankenstein product that wasn't what they intended. They made the movie they meant to make, which is kind of incredible. The studio, Fox at the time, Fox Atomic, just had no goddamn idea how to put it out there correctly because they didn't understand the actual target audience to be a valid audience. They didn't understand young women to be a valuable commodity as far as like people with dollars to spend. They just went straight for that teen boy audience that they thought would follow Megan from the Transformers movies.
And especially it's interesting you pointed out it's at the precipice of teen girls and especially women in general being validated as a valid genre audience as well, because this is entirely both a Karin Kusama film, a Diablo Cody film, and a Megan Fox film.
It's wild.
But they seem to have only latched on to the superficial Megan Fox aspect. It's like, yes, but the audience for this film is not necessarily the Transformers audience or the audience that you marketed Transformers to. So it needs a different packaging and language, which is, notoriously what this film was failed at. And obviously it's not the responsibility of the filmmakers, but of the marketing departments and the studios. But the marketing departments live blissfully in the shadows and are never blamed as much as the stars or the filmmakers are for any film, quote unquote, flopping.
Well, yeah, and Karin has been very on the record multiple times at this point saying that like there was a young man in a test screening of Jennifer's Body who had but one note on the feedback card that he handed over at the end of his time in there, and it was needs more boobs. And that was who the studio was listening to. So the first marketing materials that came out took Amanda Seyfried completely out of the visuals, elided entirely over the fact that the best friendship at the core of this movie was its central love story, and made it look like you were going to see Megan Fox taking off her clothes. And it was utterly unrepresentative of the tone, the themes, the facts of the story itself, and completely betrayed why Megan agreed to do this movie in the first place, why Diablo wanted Megan specifically to be in this movie, and surely why Karin signed on to direct this kind of story at this time. Like, they couldn't have fucked it up worse. And I think even there's a old Vulture link of Adam Brody even talking about how the studios couldn't have done a worse job, could have only almost done such a bad job of getting the movie out if they had intentionally been trying to screw it over. Like, even he acknowledged, I think, on the movie's press tour, like, I don't know how they could have screwed that up so bad on accident. Like, who made who angry? Like, because that was completely terrible.
So let's get into the movie itself, because it's going to be a much more joyous part of our conversation. So let's talk about Jennifer, and she's inextricably linked with Megan. So what do you think of Jennifer as the lead character monster of the film, but also of Megan's portrayal of her and all the metatextual layers attached to her playing Jennifer?
When you can bring in, when it is, there's the great stars aligning circumstance of being able to bring in the narrative of the star themselves into their role, and if you're able to fluidly integrate the star and the character in a way that provides added value to the story, it's such a wonderful gift to be able to see that every so often in film or television. Allison Williams in both Get Out and then subsequently in The Perfection, Blake Lively in A Simple Favor. The impact of those characters and the the way that you buy into the twists about them is amplified so much more because you bring in your baggage about what you know about those actresses, and it makes the reveals the reveals even crazier and even more surprising, and it makes the fun of their characters even more delightful because you are unpacking your own biases as you go, and you're like, well, that was a fun time. Like, you're almost glad you came in with your assumptions so you could be kind of kicked in the teeth and told you were wrong, and you're like, I'm so pleased to have been made a fool of by thinking I knew where this was going. And with Megan Fox in this role, Diablo knew she could read. She knew how the press treated her, and she saw how the press treated Megan, and she knew that for what she was trying to say with this movie, the sacrifice that Jennifer Check would be in this, to the idea that she would be sacrificed for in this world, was very much embodied by Megan in Hollywood. And Megan too saw this role and felt like, wow, I am feeling really abused and dragged around, and I'm feeling exploited. And I think that, like, from what she said, and when I was able to interview her at a 10th anniversary screening, was it kind of like, this isn't her direct quote, but to me, it sort of in my mind boils down to, like, this movie was kind of like her primal scream opportunity to exercise the way she had felt taken advantage of and screwed over in Hollywood, and make a movie that directly commented on those circumstances, but in the context of high school. And because the politics of how we sexualize and mistreat women certainly have a very vibrant and thriving petri dish that begins in, like, college, high school and middle school, when women start, young women, when girls, not young women, when girls start going through puberty and are treated as young women before they hit the threshold of 18, because we become commodities as soon as we start having boobs. And so to have Megan in this role where I got to see concentrated that thing that I did love so much about the Michaela Baines part, which was the clear spirit and ferocity of Megan, but embodied through just what happens to be one of my favorite screen archetypes, which is the, like, queen bitch teen girl in a high school movie. Like, that just, like, that's not going to be one of everybody's favorite things, but it's for a lot of people, and certainly me, one of my favorite things. And it's so immediately, the fact that it opens with that quote from Amanda's character, Needy Les, Needy Les, talking about like her lifelong friendship with Jennifer and Sandbox Love Never Dies, and the immediate interdependent, at least semi-emotionally abusive dynamic that they have between the two of them. I think really immediately for the people for the women, especially women and girls who caught on to this movie when they first saw it, it so immediately rang bells from imbalanced and vital relationships that we had in our own young lives in a way that was appropriately vicious and appropriately tongue-in-cheek and appropriately obsessive, but also surprisingly respectful and surprisingly tender and surprisingly empathetic about the wonderfully rich reality of those dynamics that are so easy to parody and make look like purely sort of salacious or dysfunctional fun from the outside, but that are actually fundamental to the emotional lives of the people in them. And they are the center of our worlds. They are the when you're in one of those dynamics, that other person is your son that you turn around. And this movie did such a good job of honoring that dynamic that it provides the foundation for all of the sensational things that come afterwards, because you have that beating heart so clearly established at the very beginning with Needy and Jennifer, and Amanda Seyfried's big wide-eyed compliment to like the brunette, vixen of Devil's Kettle is such a perfect contrast for us to sort of attach onto.
And what do you think setting Jennifer's Body within the horror genre brings to exploring this extremely recognizable but also extremely toxic central friendship at the heart of the story?
Well, and the gift that horror gives us is so well embodied in both All Cheerleaders Die in Jennifer's Body, which is where teen movies are wonderful. I love a teen movie. I love a high school coming of age movie. They are, when you can make those a horror movie, that's just the absolute best, because you're taking these. I mean, that's why something like Booksmart is really fun, because it's taking the One Crazy Night movie and putting it into the context of a couple of outcast high schoolers, and you put them in the biggest, craziest scenarios they could be in, because that's the fun of it, is seeing like young people do crazy things. That's why the movie like Good Boys, was it Good Boys or Bad Boys? Was so, successful when it came out a couple years ago. We like seeing little boys swear. We like seeing young girls ripping up through the town on a crazy night because like at the end of the day, they're only 16 and this is wild and they're behaving badly. Well, you just take the most hyperbolic kind of movie we have, which is horror, that lets you do everything bigger and louder and more on the nose. You get to take out all subtlety, and then you get to put in the metaphor of like body transformation and maybe like monsters, maybe a succubus, maybe a vampire, and all the violence and salaciousness that goes with that. And then you put that in like one of the most fun and bouncing and sort of like playing on your heartstrings and your nostalgia genres possible, like the high school friendship film. You get the best of sort of like the emotional bomb that cinema can be, because it gets to make everything bigger and louder. And you get to have, like, to me, because I like this kind of stuff, it just makes everything that I like about like the teen genre even more fun, because it gets to be brighter and it gets to be louder and it gets to be crazier. And it's not like we kind of lost the narrative thread. We sort of got off track here. It's like, no, it's supposed to be. This is a horror movie. Like, keep turning that volume up. That's what we want. And if there's anything where the emotion and the viscera and the pure emotional relentlessness is turned up, it is friendships between teenage girls. So if there is a genre that is most indicative of the unruliness of the physical and emotional time in one's life that is being a teenage girl, the only appropriate analog for that can either be completely absurdist comedy or completely unhinged horror.
And that brings me neatly onto my next question is, so in this series, I'm focusing a lot kind of on the female monstrous on screen, but Jennifer's Body is fascinating for many reasons, but it's probably probably the best, but it's also a rare type of monster to bring into a very familiar setting and a very familiar genre that has its own expectations. So it's both a high school movie with its own set of tropes and expectations from audiences, and it's both a horror monster-y movie that comes with its own set of expectations and ingrained audiences. But then it brings in the succubus, which is not really a familiar monster in either one of those genres.
Really,
it's
no.
not the one, we've got vampires, we've got zombies, we've got witches, we've got multiple versions, and some of them are much more coded feminine or much more associated with femininity or with women on screen than others are. But Succubus, what do you think kind of about what do you think about the choice of monster for Jennifer's body?
It's kind of ideal. It's actually quite perfect because I'm pulling up a little definition in front of me so I can just read. It's just Wikipedia. This is not a primary source, but for just like a sort of offhand, let's put some terms to it. Like, succubus is a demon or supernatural entity in folklore in female form that appears in dreams to seduce men, usually through sexual activity. And that's Lolita. That's what Lolita is. There is so much accountability shifted onto girls, not young women. Sometimes young women, yes, but in the case of, reality and this movie, girls, a kid, a teenager, to be accountable for the desirousness of men and the people around them. It is their responsibility to not tempt. It is their responsibility to cover their bodies lest they provoke. It is their responsibility to make up for the boys will be boys ethos that lets the kids around them, the male kids around them, get away with preying upon girls, their girls in their peer group, because, well, what were we wearing? Did we have it coming? Were you asking for it? And so that is epitomized by the snapshot of Jennifer, and we get this brunette, dangerous looking teenage girl who, as her best friend tells us at the start of the movie, tits are Jennifer's thing. Like, Needy has to dress in certain ways to accentuate certain ways about her body because tits and cleavage, that's Jennifer's thing. And she's like flirting with a adult man in a bar in Devil's Kettle the night of the Low Shoulder show, and she talks about like having sex with one of the cadets on the police force who is most certainly not in high school himself. And she's given that agency and given that self-determination, but she is also made to answer for that crime in a sort of backwards way that we never really see in a movie, where the band Low Shoulder, who wants to be big famous pop stars, they sacrifice her because they assume all of her bad girl swagger and posturing actually means, well, actually, she isn't the thing that she honestly presents herself as. We're going to make the assumption about her because we know better that she's actually got to be a virgin, because no girl's selling it this hard that she is like so sexually adventurous and experienced is actually for real. So it turns on its head the idea of, well, no actually means yes. Well, Low Shoulder decides that because what they need from her is to be a virgin for a sacrifice, that yes, like that her saying yes to sex in her life, well, no, that actually means no. Because right now that's what we need it to mean, and that's what we want it to mean. So regardless of, one of the great things about this movie is that both Jennifer and Needy have active sex lives, and they are not, Needy is preserved despite having a sexual relationship with her boyfriend Chip. And so therefore, as like the final girl, as the horror heroine, she lives in the end despite being, sullied by not being a virgin anymore. Well, it's Jennifer's unapologetic departure from her virginity that is actually what damns her in the eyes of these men who need her to serve a different purpose. But because she looks the way she does, surely, and because she has the reputation that she does, there can be a sort of societal excusing away of what would have happened to Jennifer. Because you can imagine the scenario in which if there's a scene in this movie where she goes to the authorities and she's like, well, Low Shoulder did this to me. And they're like, well, Jennifer, we have heard things about you. Well, Jennifer, we do, it's a small town and like word gets around. And if you don't want people to think that you're that kind of girl, then you should probably make different choices. And that can be sort of considered a revisionist sort of extension of the narrative that's obviously not canonical, but it's played out too many times for us to say that that's not exactly what we know would happen in real life. So the deftness of this movie to take those high school tropes, those constructs, like, the virginal girl, the nice girl, than the mean girl, the one who's having sex, and put them in such perfectly physically embodied forms as Amanda Seyfried and Megan Fox, and then to subvert those things entirely and do it joyfully and do it darkly and viciously while also making you laugh. Like, this movie is funny as hell, and it still is.
Yes.
It's somehow like, it's almost like Diablo Cody's way of writing dialogue is so specific to her that it's not of its time. It is only of Diablo Cody. You don't watch this and think like, oh, this sounds like 2009. Diablo Cody never sounded like 2009. She made certain parts of 2009 sound like her, but she exists in a snow globe of her own. So you watch it now and it's just like, oh, I don't actually feel rooted in a time and place here except for those low-rise jeans. I feel actually just like rooted in the brain of Diablo Cody.
I wanted to ask you about Jennifer Speak actually in this, because I think one of the two only things that dated this movie when I rewatched it for the purposes of this conversation was a reference to Maroon 5 as something that was cool.
Right.
And I have a notorious hatred for Adam Levine, but I'm not going to get into that. It would derail this whole thing. But and also a reference to MySpace from Low Shoulder. But other than that, it has this Heather-esque kind of bubble of timelessness where the teenagers speak like teenagers in a language that doesn't belong to anyone except that particular high school in that particular small town. And it could be any small town or any big town or any high school or any even subgroup of teenagers that all have their own particular way of speaking. And Jennifer is fascinating because she almost has a dialogue much like the Heathers in the film, have a dialogue that they almost create as a form of dominating the conversation. So I wonder kind of what you think about her way of speaking, especially to Needy, and interestingly also to Chip, who I loved her antagonistic, borderline jealous relationship to her best friend's boyfriend.
No, it is Jennifer. It's Jennifer Speak. It is not of the aughts. It just happened to have been created in the aughts. And it is a hyperbolic version, I think, of the way that, like, the sort of clueless California girl vernacular was very, like, a pop culture focused way of talking that proliferated as like, oh, this is how young people talk, when it's like, well, no, it's also like the idea of the Valley Girl accent is like nobody in that movie was from the Valley, and if they were, it was very much made fun of. Like, this is a Beverly Hills girl. This is a Bel Air girl. And so it took something and it was like a take on, it was a hyperbolic take on like how youth people talk that, like you said, just actually ends up being, when you look at it in 2020, it's like the town of Devil's Kettle was just really isolated, and somehow these kids just developed their own local vernacular and way of talking. And that is when you have just somebody who is very charismatic and who is sort of central to how you move through the world, people take the cues from those people and absorb that. It's like, I think they do that too in Never Been Kissed. Like, there's the popular kids, like, say, like, oh, you know, Rufus is the word, spread it like wildfire. And then they've decided that Rufus is the word for cool. And so throughout the movie, more and more people start adopting the word Rufus, who are from the lower social parts of the spectrum, because Rufus has been deemed cool by the cool kids. And Megan is Jennifer Check. She's like the head of the cheerleading team. She was like, what is it, like the snowflake queen? You know, oh, that was, 2 years ago before your eating disorder, as Needy points out to us. Like, so it's very believable that there could be this microcosm in this high school where people talk like that, kind of because this girl talks like that. And it matriculates out to enough key people to where they perpetuate that style of speaking that it's a great representation of Diablo Cody and her just like sheer wittiness. And I do love it so. But it is also, if you read into it further in that layer, totally believable that one person could potentially form their own little vernacular for the way that, like, maybe that 4 years of Devil's Kettle High School, or like the 2 or 3 years around her, that's how they talk. Because that's kind of just how slang and local vocabulary takes hold. She was really on the scale of Devil's Kettle, Jennifer was an influencer.
Yeah, she was an influence of the MySpace era, which was probably the true innocent times of social media.
Wow, yeah.
for those of us who lived through it, the hardest choice you had to make was who were your top 8 friends. That's it. But
a toxic system. Online social toxicity begins.
Yeah, it was good times.
Oh yeah.
Better times, at least.
Simpler. At the very least, simpler.
There's a couple of things that I want to touch on, but one of the interesting things, I'm going to bring it back into genre, is the way that Jennifer's monstrosity manifests and her transformation begins fairly early on in the film. I almost surprised myself whenever I watched it that it comes in really, really quickly, and it's extremely graphic and extremely violent from the very, very beginning, and also very supernatural. There is no finding out what she is. She is just a fully fledged succubus. Yeah. So I wonder what your thoughts are kind of on the way that her monstrosity is filmed, the way that her body becomes demonic or, possessed. There's many ways you can refer to it, and none of them I feel are entirely accurate because it just sits in its own canon of its own creation.
It has to be touched on, of course. I think that the way in which the transformation is instigated when she's taken into the woods and she's put on the stump by Low Shoulder, and the way that they sing and the way that they mock her and the way that they laugh. And the gag of like they have to print off the directions from the internet for how to do the ritual. Like that's how bumbling and stupid they are. And like the internet is becoming a more ubiquitous part of our lives, and we all carry our MapQuest directions around with us to get places. The mockery and abuse of her emotionally, and her pain and her humanity when she's on that stump as they're about to kill her. They don't think she's coming back. She's not supposed to rise again. They're killing a person, and they're going to leave this teen girl's body for dead in the woods, and they're going to go on to be big, rich, and famous. Which is something that the rich and famous are allowed to do, is to leave the bodies in the wake behind them. In the entertainment industry, that acutely takes the form of leaving women and girls discarded behind them. And Megan has spoken about how intense, and as has Karin, about how intense that day was on set to get through filming the abuse. It was freezing cold. It was, nighttime in Canada, and she's laying there having to scream for her life as she's being made fun of, and she's having these adult men laugh at her as they're supposed to in accordance with the script. But it was a very cathartic experience. In good and bad ways, that she felt like it was analogous to how she was sort of ripped apart through the studio system and by the media at that time in her career, which to have that all come pouring out on a set in a way that you're being encouraged to go through that and come out the other side, and not be like going through it and having like the director or a producer be like, hey, what's wrong? What's going on? Are you okay? But to have someone like Karin there understanding, to have that be the reason that you were put in that part. She wasn't meant to experience that catharsis and hide why and internalize it or process it silently. She was meant to put herself personally in that experience and live her grief and her rage and her sadness and her fear through it. So it was like, oh no, I'm allowed to put the pain forward right now. I'm allowed to put the darkness, behind this very burnished pop image, and have that be the fuel that gets me through this. And I'm supposed to acknowledge why. And with something like what I really like, a thing I really like about this movie is that a thing we do, I think it's done well often, but I think a thing we tend to do too much in American movies is explain things. And I like an explanation. I like to be clear on things, but I think there's a need to grapple with the supernatural or the strange or the unexpected in a way that creates a lot of dead narrative time. Like, you watch movies like Ringu in Japan, and there's a sort of closer level of buy-in to the supernatural permeation of our natural world, where there isn't as much need to explain that there has been a violation between the boundaries of the material and the immaterial, and now those worlds are blending and bad things are happening. There's sort of like, oh wait, you awakened the curse? We're fucked. How could you have awakened the curse? This is bad. Like, now we're going to have to deal with the after effects of that. Whereas in so many American movies, there's so much time dedicated to the gaslighting. You didn't see that. That's not real. What are you talking about? There's got to be an explanation for this. There's this sort of like inherent disbelieving, and a sort of, for as fundamentalist as this country is religiously, there is a wall up of sort of like spirituality and reckoning with death in everyday life. That's something that we very much keep separate in American life from death. And it's a very scary thing. And so this movie doesn't spend a lot of time explaining to you what Jennifer is. You kind of just have to come to it on your own. And maybe if you want to do some additional research, you can do that. Needy does her research and we learn from her, in the movie. But with Jennifer, there isn't this reckoning that she has to come to with her new identity. She just is it. And it's kind of like, all right, there's this sort of subtextual, all right, you thought I was the monster before. I'll just be the monster now. Like, you thought I was just this sort of ravenous teen girl, wrecking my way through the world. Guess what? Now I drink boys' blood to sustain myself. Like, I am that man-eating little girl. I am that Lolita that will cannibalize you and seduce you away from your self-determination that you feared. And I'm not going to, fret about it. I'm going to stand in front of my mirror and I'm going to feel myself and I'm going to sort of experiment with the limits of my power by setting my own tongue on fire and see what happens. And I'm going to be talking to my best friend on the phone and she's going to be telling you about bodies still burning at the bar that, is now ash on the ground. And I'm going to say, I am a god. There is a very rapid leaning into her power that is very true to Jennifer Check. Jennifer wouldn't have a crisis of confidence about this. She wouldn't have a crisis of conscience about this. She would be like, all right, my hair's getting stringy, my complexion's getting shitty, so I need to go out there and hit up my Sephora, which is drinking out of Kyle Gallner's body in an abandoned house, and so I'm going to do what I need to do. And I love the rapidity with which she just goes into her new phase. It's great. We don't waste time, and it's exactly what Jennifer would do. And Megan's proficiency with ballsiness and brazenness and screen comedy it allows her to really thrive in that character without having to get muddled down in the transition aspects of it. The change happens, and she is now living the life of the thing that she is post-change, which is not too far divorced from the thing that men make women into when women are not agreeable and do not do what they say.
I could listen to you talk about Jennifer's Body for hours, but to start wrapping up and moving into our next film, one of the things that I feel gets forgotten, or maybe not now, as we've, as the reclamation of Jennifer's Body is kind of almost complete. When we finally get a Blu-ray release with a decent cover, that I think will be the final version of the reclamation will be finalized. Yes. But one of the things I think kind of gets forgotten very often from the narrative around Jennifer's Body is that it is a queer horror film.
Oh, yes.
Or at least that is, my understanding of it. So what do you think of this, of Needy and Jennifer's relationship as being a love story and not just a friendship?
The queer horror aspect of this movie is so rewarding because it is both obviously textual in the way that they, we see them kissing each other and we understand clearly in that moment, if we may have assumed before, that there is an additional element of this friendship where it is defined, at least in part, by probably throughout their years together, as Jennifer says, but we always share your bed when we have sleepovers. This is an element of their friendship. Sometimes it gets handsy, sometimes it gets physically involved. But at the same time, what we see so often, and I love psychosexual, terrorizing female friendship movies. Those are some of my, it is absolutely one of my favorite categories of film. I love, Heavenly Creature, or was it Beautiful Creatures or Heavenly Creatures? Heavenly Creatures.
Heavenly Creatures, Single White Female.
Yeah, love Heavenly Creatures, love Single White Female, love, a fan of Persona, which is more muted, but there's still a usurpation of
absolutely
of self by these two sort of mirror imaged women. Big fan of that whole canon, truly. I love those kinds of movies. What we don't get to see hardly ever, slightly more now, but still hardly ever, is the queering of intimate relationships between women that can exist between a romantic relationship, a friend relationship, a sexual relationship, and a totally platonic relationship. There is indeed gray areas within all of those sectors that are out sort of the bounds of what heteronormativity tells us that makes them that can puts them in their compartments from one another. Like, I, for example, am a panromantic gray asexual person. That is how I identify. I didn't have that language until I was like I was 28 years old. But like once I like had the words and it was explained to me, which is like capable of being attracted to any old person, the pan, and then the asexual obviously giving you the like not having sex, but the gray in my case with a caveat to where like that's negotiable. Like, I am, to this point in my life, have not had sex with a person, but it is something that I know is not necessarily a hard stop for me forever. Like, to me, it's something that, like, bisexuality feels a bit like a moving target, and I think there will be a process of evolution where along the lines, like, those circumstances might change, or a person might change my personal circumstances. Whereas, like, an aromantic person, that's, you know, sort of colloquially defined as, like, my orientation is no. Like, no touching, no kissing, no physical stuff. Yes. Whereas for me, I'm a very physical person. I'm a very affectionate individual. And as an ace person, the loves of my life are my friendships. That is the peak of intimacy for me. But for being sexually involved with people, I will give myself over as much to an intimate connection emotionally as another person is willing to meet me in that regard. And what that incorporates to with Jennifer's body is that we see in this movie the central friendship between Jennifer and Needy is the central love story, without taking away from the genuine connection between Needy and Chip. What we so often see in the psychosexual, like, female terror movies is that it is them against the world. Is that these relationships must exist at the cost of all other relationships. Is that these two people are a microcosm where they don't know where one ends and the other begins, and the pressure of that and the consumptive power of it drives them to be murderous and insane. And that stuff is super fun to watch, and I love it, and it's erotic sometimes, and it can be really hot and fun. But that's not quite, hopefully, real life for people. Whereas I can have these friendships in my life that are not paramount to romantic relationships, but tantamount. They exist in equal importance, which is something that society tells us is not real. Because there's that phrase, we're just friends. As though friendship cannot exist at an emotionally significant tier to the romantic love in one's life. Well, what we see in this movie is Jennifer and Needy being interdependent on one another and having this actual, like, telepathic bond with one another where they can, like, Needy can feel where Jennifer is and what she's doing. But that doesn't mean she loves Chip less. There is not less room in her life for Chip. I mean, you have to divide one's time. And of course, people get jealous of one another. That's just relationships. But it doesn't come at the cost of her love for Chip. She is just as devoted to him as she is a Jennifer. But they occupy separate parts of her life, so they don't have to be in competition with one another. They can coexist. And the fact that this movie recognizes that it doesn't have to be a war between these women and the world for them to be as close to each other as they feel compelled to be, while also allowing for them to have other meaningful relationships in their life, is so much more indicative of how the real world balance actually is when you're juggling the different types of relationships, you know, when you're in your sphere. And also, it is so much more respectful of the meaning and depth and connection of these friendships in our lives. And, you know, speaking in the context of women, the necessity of female connectivity between one another in a world that is so hostile to us, to have those partnerships and companionships and group dynamics where we can intimately bond with one another in a way that reinforces each of us and protects each of us and strengthens each of us and allows for us to be vulnerable in the face of so many things that want to hurt us. This is vital. And so I get my best friendship movie where, like, I get the great toxic female friendship thing that's super fun. And then I get my friendship love story movie where these two girls are so connected to one another that they are telepathically bound. And hey, because it's their way and they're totally down with it, consensually, sometimes they make out and touch each other, and that's totally cool. And you can have that in a friendship without it being a romantic relationships in your life, because intimacy is a very big spectrum. And it doesn't just have to mean the person you're fucking and they get to hear all your secrets and they're your one true companion and they're your other half of your heart. No. There's a lot of compartments that people can fit into. And so what this movie does is it actually gives a queer eye into female friendship that we so rarely see done with such nuance and respect and just wonderful humor while also giving us the fun genre aspects of it, which is why this movie gets to be a party too, where we get like a micro close-up on a makeout, because as Karin and Diablo have said, this is also a horror movie. There is like that exploitation cinema bit of salacious fun that gets to creep in too, where it also gets to be hot, and it also gets to be sexy, and it also gets to be fun. And those things can coexist in an intimate, tender story of female friendship without being exploitative of that fact. They can be complementary to one another. They do not have to exist as mutually exclusive when watching a horror movie, when watching a genre picture.
I mean, I'm literally speechless, just nodding aggressively, which is, again, terrible podcast content.
It can be a real stem winder. So yeah, it's a favorite topic. It's a favorite topic.
I can tell. It's glorious to listen. I can't wait for people to hear this. I wanted to wrap up the conversation around Jennifer's body by asking, so what I found really interesting about the ending of the film is that it's, as I've kind of been revisiting or rediscovering a lot of these female monstrous films, one of the consistent tropes is that the monster always has to die at the end. This is consistent not just with the monstrous feminine, but kind of usually the monster does have to be defeated. Yeah. But what I find interesting is, though, Jennifer does die at the end. The monstrosity lives on in Needy. So technically, Needy becomes the monster, and she lives on, and she gets to escape as well in the final scene. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on the ending, and kind of what do you think this film says about female monstrosity on screen?
In my head, like it's not a fault with the film that Jennifer dies. In my headcanon, in a 2020 me, I'm like, maybe now Jennifer could live if it got made and everything stayed the same, but they just changed that one little bit. I think what I like about what I don't not like, what I accept, because I want Jennifer to live, what I accept about it is that when you have that really embattled friendship, sometimes the only way to emancipate yourself from it is to cut it out entirely. And because this is a genre movie, the circumstances of cutting it out means killing the monster, means killing the person. I don't think this undermines their story as Jennifer and Needy, because I think it's that thing of where, like, listen, sometimes you gotta say no. Like, not everybody can stay in your life forever. It actually is the healthier thing sometimes to cut a person out of your life that is abusive, or that is not a value add, or that just makes your life harder, or prevents you from growing and changing, or that you're sort of so surgically bound to, you actually can't be the best you while you're still attached to them. It's like it's a breakup. Like, they essentially had their ultimate breakup, but when you break up with someone in a horror movie, you kill them in a bed by stabbing them with a box knife, and their monstrous form like deteriorates as their mom walks in and screams and finds you both there in blood. So but because like, and what makes it work is the fact that the monstrous doesn't die, and that Jennifer's power becomes her monstrosity after her transformation. Her monstrosity, she, it's not an ideal way, but it's what keeps her. It's what gives her powers. It's what keeps her vital. It's what makes her the most radiant form of herself. And when that power passes on to Needy through, like, the injury she sustained from Jennifer, she, like, takes on qualities of the succubi. That enables her to break out of her mental institution prison. That it gives her the ability to levitate. It makes her stronger. It makes her more agile. It makes her more frightening. And so I don't think we know necessarily if she has sort of like an evolution from it where she doesn't have to feed to live, but maybe she just sort of like got the good stuff but doesn't have to take the murdery stuff with her. But she is able to live her life. She is able to live her life further on because of the monstrous qualities she has taken on from her best friend. And no doubt too, like we know from the credit sequence that she goes on to get vengeance for Jennifer. Like, regardless of everything that Jennifer did and killing Chip and ruining her life in certain ways, she still was like, I'm going to find those fuckers and I'm going to kill them because they took Jennifer from me. They started all this, and I'm not only like, I already ended it because she's gone, but you know what? For spite, I'm just going to take those bitch ass boys out of the game because that's what they deserve. And then she's going to go on living her life, probably harder to catch, harder to kill, harder to pin down, because she now embodies these qualities that she wouldn't be in possession of, cost benefit analysis of it all, but that she wouldn't be in possession of without them having been imbued into her by Jennifer. So the monstrosity comes with its give and take, which I think is I like a revenge film where the person just rises at the end and like, but for being a bit beat up, they killed 1 million people and they came out, alive, and now they're going to go, live their life afterwards. Like, that's totally fun, but there is a cost benefit to this. There does get to be a bargain. Like, I accept that the monstrosity does not come with only unbridled power and beauty and energy and life, but it also comes with the fact that you have to make the choice. You have to be okay with the fact that your ledger's going to be read in certain ways, because we shouldn't view power as something that just comes without limits or restrictions. Like, responsibly, we shouldn't view power as just something we only lust for without any boundaries on it. So I like the perpetuation of the female monster, even if she can't like walk off hand in hand with Jennifer into the sunset at the end of the day. I like the perpetuation of the female monster, even while the malignant form of that monstrosity had to be put down for the story to end. Like, yeah, Jennifer was gonna keep abusing that shit. So like, Needy did what she had to do. But I think it's worth noting that in the process of killing the monster, when they have the scene in the bed with the levitating and the fighting, moment where Jennifer sort of relinquishes to Needy, where she sort of gives way in the fight, is when Needy pulls the locket from her neck, when she pulls the Biff necklace off.
Yes.
And that you see, you see Jennifer kind of relent and start falling backwards, and as she collapses into the bed, Needy falls down and plunges the knife into her chest, and you see the best friend necklace like tumbling and fall to the ground. And like the thing that has been most deeply severed in that moment is their friendship. Like, that's the heartbreak. That's the thing that, for all of her posturing, gets Jennifer to submit or shocks her enough into sort of a moment of sobriety to like lose track of the fight and sort of lose her strength. And when she loses Needy, she loses her power. For that moment, she loses the strength to sort of fight back. And that's an incredible fucking metaphor. And as Diablo has said in interviews before, when Needy stabs her and Jennifer says like, ow, my tit, and Needy says to her, no, your heart. Like, that gets to the heart of that gets to the core of what Cody wanted to convey, which is like, we're going to make like tits jokes in this, and we're going to laugh, and we're going to have the Jennifer speak. But at the end of this is about the heart of it. And the heart of this is Jennifer and Needy. And by leaving you, by breaking up with you, by killing you, like, I'm breaking your heart. And then Jennifer dies on the bed, and it's a whole mess. But that is, like, I cry watching the end of that because it's just so good. And it like, you don't get things that revere, you don't get things that are that much fun and that crazy and are that like good looking, that revere that kind of love story so much. Hardly ever. And that it came in 2009, kind of a full decade before we considered those conversations as valid ones that we should be having more often in like mainstream culture criticism circles. That is so goddamn impressive. Like, what they did was so goddamn impressive. And, you fucked up the marketing, Fox Atomic, RAP Fox Atomic, but thanks for being hands off while they were making this movie and letting them put out the product that they intended to create. That still blows my mind to this day.
Despite all the terrible marketing and the terrible release, the film itself is intact, and we can still watch it and we can still access it.
Yeah, and the thing, like when these interviews happen, you don't hear the creators behind it saying, "This isn't the movie we intended to make." They actually got to make the movie they wanted to make. It saw the world in the way that it was supposed to, and it's shocking that for a company that's so mismanaged, and so misunderstood what it was, that they actually just let it happen.
That was a wonderful dissection of Jennifer's body.
Great! I'm so happy.